Hello everyone, welcome back. The topic that we're going to talk about today is slavery. Okay, this is something that I've studied in great detail going back over 15 years. And if you're going to study slavery, the absolute worst place that you can start is with American history. Okay, because American history is very short. I mean, we got some 250 years of American history. We had slavery in the United States for about 150 years, maybe 200 years, which is basically nothing, okay? Slavery is over 5,000 years old, okay? So to look at a small segment of slavery, over a very short period of time, in one relatively insignificant place on the planet, is not going to give you a good idea of what slavery is, how it developed, what it was about. Okay, so if you really want to understand slavery, you gotta look at the whole thing. You gotta look at slavery over 5,000 years. Now, if you are if you're a European, right? If you are a person that lives in Europe and watching this video, right? And you are comfortable with the fact that your ancestors were both slave owners and slaves. Okay, because if you're anywhere in Europe, whether you be in the Mediterranean or in the north, the Romans were slavers, the Greeks were slavers, the Vikings were slavers, and if you didn't have outright slavery, you had this system called serfdom, okay, and basically what serfdom was is that the peasants were tied to the land, and that consisted of at least about 95% of the population, and if you were a serf, you were tied to the land. The land was basically owned and controlled by a landlord, and he owned the land and he owned everything on the land. Okay, and so basically you couldn't produce anything on that land that was yours. Everything belonged to the landlord, including yourself. And he had sole authority of law, so he could basically kill you for any reason. He could whip you for any reason. If you didn't think you were working hard enough, he could kill you. So that's what it meant to be a land baron in Europe. Okay, you owned the land. Okay, and you owned and controlled all the people on that land, and you could do anything you wanted with them. If you had women that you liked on that land, you could take any women you wanted to, because that was your land, and everything on that land was yours. Okay, so that's what it meant to be a land baron in Europe. Okay, so if you are of European descent, you are probably part of the 95% of the population that was a serf. Okay, so you have slave blood in you. Okay, so Europeans have no issue with this, because they know that they are the descendants of slaves. If you are a person that's living in Africa, okay, and watching this video, okay, you also know that you were both a slave owner and a slave at some point, or your ancestors were, not you, but your ancestors, right? If you are a person that's living in Africa and watching this video, you know for a fact that your ancestors were both slave owners and slaves, okay? Because basically you had these tribes, they're always fighting back and forth, with each other. And in the ancient world, it's important to understand that, who was a free man and who was a slave was a question of who won or lost the last war, okay? So you win a war, you take slaves. You lose a war, you become a slave, okay? And that's how slavery worked in the ancient world. And the mindset behind this, okay, especially, and this particular piece comes from the Greeks, that I learned this from. If you were when you had two people that went to war, or two city-states or whatever that went to war, the gods took sides, all right? So if you were on the losing side, basically your gods were weak, or the gods hated you, okay? So your fate was to die, okay? So if you lost a war, the only right you had was to die. And basically, what the winners did is they said, hey, with this group of people here, we're going to make an exception. We're not going to slaughter them. We're going to take them as slaves, okay? So that was the mindset behind slavery in the ancient world. Now, when you fast forward a little bit and you bring Christianity into this, things get a little bit confusing, because with Christianity, supposedly we're all, all people come from the same God. So now you can't sit there and say, hey, my God is stronger than yours, or my God is better than yours, and that's why your God lost and you're going to become a slave. You can't quite use that. So they had to try and find other explanations, other excuses. When the Africans basically went to, when those tribes went to war with each other, I mean, obviously they didn't care about any of that God stuff. You lose, you become a slave. They sold the captives to the Europeans. The Europeans needed to justify that somehow, and they basically came up with this whole race thing, okay? And that was an excuse. They wanted the slaves. They had to somehow reconcile this with their religion. So they came up with this idea of race, to say, okay, these people are somehow different than us. Okay, the problem with that is that slave owners, and this goes back many centuries, right? Slave owners typically have sex with their female slaves, and they produce mixed children. So in American history, okay, you have this, you had slavery for a very brief period that was somewhat bound by race, but if that had been allowed to continue, and I'm not saying should be, but if it had been allowed to continue, something would have changed, because you would have had a higher and higher percentage of mixed children. And where do they fall in? Are they slaves or are they not slaves? And what happens, and what we see in Roman history, is that you end up with a class society. Okay, so you end up with different classes. So if slavery was, that's what most likely would have happened if slavery was never terminated in the United States. And the founding fathers of the United States, they were dead set against the class system. Okay, they didn't want a class system. So as the history of the United States progressed, they had this issue that they had to reconcile. Okay, they foresaw that if the slave trend was allowed to continue, it would have ultimately led to a class system. And I believe that's part of the reason why you had a lot of abolitionists in the North, okay, that were very much against slavery, and in fact wanted to, after the slaves were freed, they wanted to deport them, so that they wouldn't have this class system that they were against. But that's kind of like a footnote, because we never went that route. We ended up, we had a civil war. We ended slavery in one shot, and that was the end of that. But if it was allowed to continue, like it continued in, during Roman times, right? Because Rome had a history of over 1,000 years, and Rome became an empire because of slavery. What would happen with Rome is, early on they started having these victories. And as they had, more and more victories, they started taking more and more slaves, and then bringing them back. And the problem with slavery is that, when you bring in slaves, the way the Romans did, you basically worked them to death. Okay, the Romans put the slaves in the mines or in the fields, gave them very little care, very little food, and they basically worked them to death. So what that meant is that in traditional Greek, Roman, Viking societies, where you're basically working your slaves to death, they're not reproducing, right? They're not, because it takes a lot of effort to raise, to have, for slaves to make babies and make new slaves. That's a lot of effort, and so slaves really weren't very good at reproducing. So what that meant is that the Romans and the Greeks and the Vikings had to basically constantly go to war in order to make new slaves. Okay, so the part of the reason why Rome became a worldwide empire is because they needed to continually feed their need for new slaves. Okay, because the slaves weren't reproducing. And then at some point later on, they after during the Dark Ages, they in Europe, actually it was as they were coming out of the Dark Ages. In fact, I think it actually brought us out of the Dark Ages sometime around 1000 AD. We start seeing that slavery is, by 1000 AD in Europe, you really don't have slavery. They've now transitioned to serfdom, where the people are tied to the land. And because what they found is that if you tie the people to the land, okay, through the system of serfdom, you get all the benefits of slavery, right? You can work them, take everything that you can from them, right? Or everything that they produce, you can take it from them. But in that system, they are able to reproduce, okay? So you don't have to have constant warfare in order to get more slaves, okay? So that's how slavery kind of fell out of favor in Europe, okay? So in a nutshell, that is kind of the history of slavery. How it progressed, and like I said, if you want to understand slavery, study the rest of the world, okay? Start with ancient times and come forward from there, and then finish up with American history, and that will give you a much better perspective of the history of slavery and how we got to the type of slavery that we had here in the United States. Thanks for watching. I'll see you guys next time.